There's a dangerous lie that circulates among mountaineers. It whispers that some peaks are forgiving, that certain summits, while tall, are somehow gentler than their neighbors, that if you pick the right mountain, you can cheat the death zone of its usual toll. Cho Oyu has lived under this lie for decades. Standing at 8,188 meters, it is the sixth tallest mountain on Earth and one of only 14 peaks that pierce the 8,000-meter threshold. Among these so-called 8,000ers, Cho Oyu has earned a reputation as the easiest to climb, a moderate slope, a straightforward route, the kind of mountain that guided expeditions favor, where clients with enough money and modest experience can bag a Himalayan giant without the chaos of Everest or the technical nightmares of Annapurna. And so, climbers come, by the hundreds, every season. Cho Oyu has become the second most climbed 8,000er in the world, trailing only Everest itself. The mountain's accessibility has transformed it into a proving ground, a stepping stone, a line on a resume before attempting something harder. But here's what that reputation conceals. Cho Oyu is still an 8,000er. It still plunges climbers into the death zone, where oxygen becomes so scarce that the human body begins consuming itself to survive. It still conjures storms that materialize from nothing and swallow entire mountainsides in minutes. It still holds crevasses, ice falls, and avalanche-prone slopes that do not care how easy your guidebook said this would be. On the morning of May 5th, 2000, two climbers set out from Camp 3 to claim the summit. The weather was clear. The route was familiar. Everything suggested a routine ascent on the world's most forgiving 8,000er. By nightfall, both climbers had vanished into a storm that erased all trace of their passage. Their bodies were never recovered. This is the story of how Cho Oyu reminded the climbing world of a truth that should never have been forgotten. There is no such thing as an easy 8,000er. There is only the illusion of safety and the mountains that shatter it. To understand what happened on Cho Oyu in May 2000, you first have to understand why so many climbers were there in the first place. And the answer comes down to one word: reputation. Among the world's 14 8,000ers, those rare peaks that pierce the 8,000-meter threshold, Cho Oyu has long been considered the most approachable. The northwest face offers a moderate slope with minimal technical difficulty. The route to the summit is straightforward, well-documented, and relatively free of the objective hazards that plague mountains like K2 or Annapurna. For climbers looking to add an 8,000er to their resume without gambling their lives on a near-suicidal ascent, Cho Oyu became the obvious choice. And so, they came. Season after season, expedition after expedition. Guided groups with wealthy clients. Experienced mountaineers using it as a warm-up for harder peaks. Ambitious climbers chasing the prestige that comes with standing atop one of Earth's highest summits. By 2000, Cho Oyu had become the second most climbed 8,000er in the world, trailing only Everest itself. But reputation is a dangerous thing. It can make people forget that 8,000 meters is 8,000 meters, no matter how gentle the slope looks from base camp. On April 15, 2000, a small expedition arrived at the Advanced Northwest Base Camp on Cho Oyu. The team consisted of 9 climbers, a mix of Finns and Russians, who had joined forces for what they hoped would be a successful summit bid. The Russians were the experienced core of the group, seasoned mountaineers who had climbed at extreme altitude before. They would lead the expedition, set the strategy, and make the critical decisions when conditions demanded it. The Finns had paid for the privilege of joining, trusting the Russians to guide them safely up and back down. Their plan was methodical. They would ascend the standard northwest face route, establishing 3 camps along the way. Camp 1 at 6,400 meters, Camp 2 at 7,000 meters, Camp 3 at 7,400 meters, the final staging point before the push to the summit. Each camp would be stocked with supplies. Each transition would allow time for acclimatization. Nothing rushed, nothing reckless. When they arrived at Advanced Base Camp, they found 2 other expeditions already there. A Korean team and an Iranian team, both working to establish their own routes up the mountain. The presence of other climbers was reassuring. Sherpas from the Korean and Iranian groups were already fixing ropes and preparing the path between camps. The infrastructure was taking shape. The 9 climbers wasted no time. They began their ascent almost immediately, eager to establish their camps and acclimatize to the punishing altitude. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The weather was cooperating. The route was coming together. Cho Oyu was living up to its reputation as the forgiving 8,000er, but the mountain had not yet shown them what it was capable of. By April 17th, the expedition had reached Camp 1. The climbers settled into the exhausting rhythm that defines high-altitude mountaineering. Haul gear up, descend to recover, haul more gear up, repeat. It is tedious, grueling work, but absolutely necessary. Every tent, every canister of fuel, every packet of food at the higher camps represents hours of labor at elevations where even walking leaves you gasping. While the expedition focused on stocking Camp 1, Sherpas from the Korean and Iranian teams were pushing higher, fixing ropes through the most treacherous section of the route. Between Camp 1 and Camp 2 lies an icefall, a frozen cascade of unstable ice blocks and deep crevasses that climbers must navigate with extreme care. Beyond the icefall stretches a 200-meter sheet of slick ice, polished smooth by wind and time. One wrong step, one momentary lapse in concentration, and the mountain would claim another victim. But on April 20th, Cho Oyu reminded everyone that technical difficulty was not the only danger on this mountain. The weather turned without warning. Clouds rolled in, temperatures plummeted, and a blizzard swept across the upper slopes with ferocious intensity. The expedition had no choice but to abandon their progress and descend to base camp. They huddled in their tents as the storm raged outside, waiting for a window that might never come. By April 21st, the skies had cleared enough for the team to resume operations. They ferried more supplies to Camp 1 and prepared to push through the icefall toward Camp 2. But the altitude was beginning to take its toll. Several climbers developed symptoms of altitude sickness, pounding headaches, nausea, a bone-deep fatigue that no amount of rest seemed to cure. The group made the wise decision to pause and acclimatize properly before pushing higher. Those rest days proved invaluable. By April 27th, the team had reached Camp 2 at 7,000 meters, their bodies slowly adapting to the thinning air. They began stockpiling supplies and planning their push to the final camp, Camp 3 at 7,400 meters. The summit was finally within reach. On May 2nd, the three most experienced Russians made their move. They climbed to Camp 3, pitched their tents, and prepared for a potential summit bid. But almost immediately, the mountain showed its teeth again. The wind at Camp 3 was unlike anything they had encountered below. Violent gusts tore across the exposed slope, so powerful that the climbers later recalled, feeling as though they might be lifted off the ground entirely. Staying was impossible. They retreated to base camp, shaken but alive. The foul weather passed quickly. Within days, another weather window appeared to be opening. Clear skies, manageable winds, a narrow opportunity for those willing to seize it. The Russian trio elected to rest at base camp and wait for more stable conditions. But not everyone shared their patience. Others in the expedition saw the clearing weather and felt the pull that every mountaineer dreads and desires in equal measure. Summit fever had begun to take hold. Among those who had stayed behind during the Russian trio's first attempt at Camp 3 was Pavel Bonadesyenko. The 38-year-old Russian had been struggling with altitude sickness and was in no condition to join his countrymen when they pushed higher on May 2nd. But after several days of rest, he was feeling stronger. The new weather window beckoned, and Pavel was determined not to miss his chance. He would lead the next push. Joining him were two members of the Finnish contingent. Jorma Alainen, the 50-year-old team leader on the Finnish side, was an experienced outdoorsman eager to add Cho Oyu to his list of accomplishments. And Nora Toivonen, just 25 years old, was the youngest member of the expedition. What she lacked in experience, she made up for in determination. Both Finns trusted Pavel to guide them through the final stages of the climb. On the evening of May 4th, the three climbers reunited at Camp 3. They had made good time ascending from the lower camps, and spirits were high. The weather was holding. The summit was less than 800 vertical meters above them. If conditions remained favorable, they could reach the top the following day. The morning of May 5th dawned clear, painfully, deceptively clear. The sun rose over the Himalayas, illuminating the white slopes of Cho Oyu in brilliant golden light. But appearances meant nothing at this altitude. The temperature hovered around -40 degrees, and the wind cut through every layer of clothing like a blade. Jorma decided to stay behind. He was exhausted from the push to Camp 3 and knew his body needed rest before attempting the summit. Pavel and Nora, however, felt strong enough to go. At 5:30 in the morning, the pair set off into the frozen silence, beginning their final ascent. The plan was simple: 10 to 12 hours round trip. Reach the summit by early afternoon, descend before dark, return to Camp 3 with daylight to spare. It was a tight schedule, but manageable if everything went smoothly. At 12:15 in the afternoon, base camp established radio contact with Nora. Her voice crackled through the static, strained but coherent. "It's really cold," she reported. "If you stop, it's unbearable. Otherwise, we're fine." Base camp relayed troubling news in return. A storm system was approaching. If they wanted to summit that day, they needed to move faster. An hour later, observers at base camp spotted the two climbers through a telescope. They were still visible near the top, but the sight brought no relief. Pavel and Nora were approximately 90 minutes from the summit plateau and nearly 2 hours from the true summit. According to their original schedule, they should have already been standing on top. They were critically behind. The figures disappeared from view as clouds began swirling around the upper slopes. By 5 o'clock that evening, the storm had swallowed the entire upper half of Cho Oyu. Pavel and Nora were somewhere inside it, invisible and unreachable. The waiting began. At Camp 3, Yorma Alanin sat alone in his tent as the blizzard screamed outside. He had expected Pavel and Nora to return hours ago. The sun had set. The temperature had plunged even further into the brutal negatives, and still, there was no sign of them. The wind tore at the fabric of his shelter with such violence that Yorma wondered if the tent itself might be ripped from its anchors. He stared into the howling darkness, willing two figures to emerge from the white chaos. None came. Back at base camp, the rest of the expedition monitored the radio in tense silence. Every burst of static made them lean closer, hoping to hear a voice. The minutes stretched into hours. The storm showed no sign of relenting. Then, at approximately 7 o'clock in the evening, the radio crackled to life. It was Nora. Her voice was faint, broken, barely audible over the interference. "Does anyone hear?" she began, and then nothing. A loud burst of static swallowed whatever words came next, and the transmission cut to silence. The team scrambled to respond. They called her name into the radio again and again, adjusting frequencies, boosting signals, desperate to re-establish contact. But there was only static. Nora never spoke again. Yorma spent the entire night flashing his headlamp into the darkness outside his tent. On and off, a lonely beacon in the void, hoping to guide two lost climbers back to safety. He did not sleep. He did not stop. But no one came. By May 6th, the expedition faced an agonizing truth. No one could survive a full night exposed to those conditions at that altitude. Pavel and Nora were gone. The storm persisted for 2 more days, trapping everyone in place and making any search impossible. When the weather finally cleared on May 8th, the 3 Russian climbers who had been resting at base camp made their own push for the summit. They hoped to find some trace of their missing companions along the way. They found nothing. On May 10th, a small memorial service was held at base camp. Prayers were spoken, memories were shared. The mountain stood above them in silence, indifferent to the grief below. The following day, the Korean team reached the summit and reported a chilling discovery. They had found footprints leading from the true summit toward the southern edge of the plateau. The tracks continued to the edge and then simply vanished. There was nothing beyond but a sheer rock face plunging thousands of meters into Nepal. The 3 remaining Russian climbers completed their own summit attempt shortly after. They searched every meter of the route they could safely reach. No bodies, no equipment, no final message scratched into the snow. Pavel Bonadesienko and Nora Toivonen had disappeared completely. The mountain had taken them and offered nothing in return. Not closure, not answers, just silence, and the wind and the empty white expanse where 2 climbers had walked for the last time. The investigation that followed painted a clear picture of what went wrong. Pavel and Nora had not taken adequate time to acclimatize. They were climbing without supplemental oxygen in the death zone, where the air holds so little oxygen that even resting humans cannot sustain their bodies for more than a few days. Above 8,000 meters, the lack of oxygen impairs judgment, degrades motor skills, and can induce vivid hallucinations. Small distances become monumental struggles. Clear thinking becomes impossible precisely when clear thinking matters most. It appeared that the pair had reached the summit, but in the whiteout conditions they became disoriented. Instead of descending the way they came, they wandered toward the southern edge of the summit plateau and tumbled down the steep rock face into Nepal. Their bodies were never found. The more experienced Russian climbers who had led the expedition noted that Pavel and the Finns had deviated from the planned descent strategy. They had rushed toward the summit during a volatile weather window, driven by what mountaineers call summit fever, that dangerous compulsion to reach the top, regardless of conditions or consequences. The Russians maintained that if the group had followed the original plan, if they had waited for stable weather, if they had not let ambition override caution, the disaster could likely have been avoided entirely. But perhaps that is the cruelest lesson Cho Oyu teaches. The mountain's reputation for being easy attracts climbers who underestimate what an 8,000er truly demands. They see the moderate slopes and the guided expeditions and the statistics that suggest favorable odds. What they do not see is the death zone waiting above, indifferent to reputations and expectations, ready to punish any lapse in judgment with absolute finality. Nora Toivonen was 25 years old. Pavel Bonadesyenko was 38. They climbed toward a summit that thousands have reached before and since. But Cho Oyu does not grant safe passage simply because it has done so before. The mountain remembers no one. It forgives nothing, and it has never once cared what the guidebooks say.